recording. Can everyone see my screen okay? If you could just do like a little thumbs up or indicate in the chat, that'd be brilliant. Okay, yeah, it's a few thumbs up, marvelous. Okay, so welcome everyone to this little course that I've cobbled together, all about botanical surveys for development. For those of you who don't know me, hello, my name is Josh Stiles. I am a botanical specialist. I'm the botanical specialist for Atkins, quite a big consultancy. And I do that 4 days a week. I'm a FISC 6 botanist, as well as my consultancy work. I run a conservation program with Chester Zoo, do loads of planty stuff. And so today I'm going to be talking about botanical surveys in the context of development. It's a course that's really aimed at consultant ecologists, as well as sort of county ecologists and maybe anyone with a general interest. And what I really want to do today is address a big gap that we have at the moment in the guidance, and that gap refers to specialist botanical surveys for development. There isn't any, really. There isn't any guidance that tells us when to recommend and do further botanical surveys on top of sort of basic level habitat surveys that we may or may not have already done on a site. And there's no guidance to tell us what a further botanical survey should include, which brings about all kinds of different issues. And so what I'm going to be using the time today to talk about is, number one, when to recommend and do further botanical surveys and seek further botanical inputs and why. And also what a further botanical survey, a specialist botanical survey, should include and why. First and foremost, let's talk about how wonderful plants are, because plants are indeed the fundamental basis of pretty well all life on the planet. Our biodiversity relies, our wildlife relies on plants as the cornerstone of our ecosystems, but also we rely on them for so much as well. Plant extinction is a huge deal, not just to biodiversity, but to us. About 40% of our pharmaceuticals, for example, originate or are derived from secondary metabolites and chemicals that plants produce. And whilst estimates suggest that plant extinctions globally account for the loss of at least one major drug every 2 years, plants are amazing. They're fundamental, not just to biodiversity, but to us, and of course they are threatened. But of course today we're talking about botanical survey in the context of development, and so although that might not mean very much to a planner, what is important to a planner or to people that we deal with for projects as commercial ecologists, of course, materially important ecological considerations for development do not just include dormice, do not just include bats and great crested newts and barn owls. They include both habitats and important plants, which are arguably, sorry to offend, the single most important consideration for development, because it's our habitats, it's our important plants that are the cornerstone of everything else. So it's important to consider our habitats, our plants, because plants are great, they're threatened, we have threatened habitats, but also important habitats and plants are materially important considerations for the projects that we work on Okay. So this course is called Botanical Surveys for Development. What is a botanical survey? Well, broadly speaking, as I'm sure we all already appreciate, it's a broad term to describe a survey and assessment of floristic features over a given area, which could include a survey and assessment of plant species and those broader communities, those broader habitats. And very basic, very basic level survey approaches that could be considered as a type of botanical survey might include our phase 1 or UK habitat survey. BMG condition assessments also have quite a heavy element of botanical survey associated with them. However, these are all relatively basic level botanical surveys. They don't consider things, generally speaking, in very much detail at all. And so for the purposes of this webinar training course, whatever you want to call it, a botanical survey refers to a detailed survey and assessment of both plants and plant community composition. So if I was to do a detailed botanical survey of this glorious grassland that I've pictured to the right, if I was to do a specialist botanical survey there, I could look at the habitat type, so lowland meadow, and it's also a lowland meadow that's host to many important species, one of which might include our English eyebright, which is an endemic species of principal importance, red list endangered in England. It's associated with numerous conservation designations that are relevant to us. And so, yeah, for the purposes of this webinar, botanical survey excludes those very basic level habitat survey types that I'm sure we're all very familiar with, and includes a detailed assessment of both plants and plant community composition. As I said at the beginning of this presentation, beyond those basic habitat survey approaches, our phase 1, our UK hab might be included in that as well, there is little to no guidance on botanical survey reporting for development, although general guidance on sort of survey methods for different plants and habitats do exist for a variety of literature, like Hill, biodiversity methods. And of course, this brings a real dilemma. It means that non-specialists, and understandably so, people who aren't specialist botanists, which is the majority of ecologists, don't necessarily understand when a further botanical survey, a survey beyond a basic level habitat survey like our phase 1, is required. Ecologists don't necessarily understand when those further surveys are required, as well as including people like county ecologists. But not only do they, and understandably so, because of this lack of guidance, potentially not understand when a botanical survey is required, but quite often ecologists don't understand, again, understandably so, it's not criticism at all, what a botanical survey should include. And so quite often we could get botanical survey reports that don't consider all of the relevant aspects that we need to determine the potential impacts and severity, the magnitude of impacts for a development or scheme that we're working on. And that's a big problem. And so, hello, that's why I've sort of cobbled this presentation together to hopefully give a bit more information on when to recommend a botanical survey and why, but also what that botanical survey should include. and why. So that hopefully everyone watching this at the end will be that bit more equipped to know when to recommend a survey, and if you've commissioned this further botanical survey and assessment, you'll know and be a bit more equipped on how to review it. Yeah, I have set a couple of learning objectives for today, which I think I've already gone over really. First, to understand when botanical surveys should be undertaken and why in the context of development. And number two, to understand what a commercial botanical survey should include. But first and foremost, I think it's really important to understand our obligations as ecologists. As part of most of the developments and projects that we're going to be involved in, we are going to be producing or looking to produce something like an ecological impact assessment or something very similar. And as part of our ecological impact assessment, it is our obligation to report on all of our important ecological features, our IEFs, which includes important habitats, important species, as well as ecosystems, including ecosystem function and process. So at this picture here, we have a number of important ecological features, at least when it comes to plants. We have an oligotrophic lake, but we also have rocky outcrops with important plants like this nationally scarce green spleenwort. Okay, so our obligations as ecologists in the context of development is to report on our important ecological features, our fauna, so our bats, our dormice, our badgers, whatever, as well as important fungi, mycological features, and important floristic features, including habitats and important plant species. So, when it comes to plants and habitats, what can constitute an important feature? Well, for species, an important ecological, or rather an important species that constitutes this important ecological feature, I feel like I'm saying important an awful lot today already, can include some of our most threatened species, which receive the highest levels of protection. So this can include species like June wormwood, which are currently, although perhaps not for much longer after JNCC's quinquennial review, protected under Schedule 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. So we can have plants that receive special protection under Schedule 8 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. We can have European protected species, including bats, but we can also have European protected species of plants, like this gorgeous, diminutive little bryophyte called petalwort, which looks like a lettuce that has loads of little slug eggs laid amongst it in this picture here. Very peculiar little liverwort. And petalwort receives full protection under Schedule 5 of the Conservation, Habitats and Species Regs. So it's a European protected species. Important plants can include specially protected species, but can also include species which aren't specially protected. Important ecological features can include species of principal importance and given special recognition under various bits of legislation, like, for example, Section 41 of the NERC Act for England, Section 7 of the Environment Act for Wales. And one example of a species of principal importance is right here. It's purple ramping fumit tree, which is a very special and gorgeous little plant. So we can have specially protected, plants. And we can also have species of principal importance. Both of those things constitute important ecological features. But when it comes to plant species, it's not just those two things that we need to report on that constitute our IEFs. Plants which don't receive special protection or recognition under legislation or policy can still be important, and we still need to report, include them within our reports and assess impacts to them and recommend avoidance, mitigation, compensation measures accordingly. Important species of plant can include endemic species, species endemic to a country or region. It can include red listed plants, plants that are near threatened, red list vulnerable, endangered, critically endangered, so on and so on. It can include nationally rare or scarce species of plants, so plants that are found at fewer than, 15 or 100 hectares, 10 kilometre squares, respectively. It can include species that are at the edge of their range or very rare in a given area. So you might get a species that is at the very northern or southern limit of its range. Or you could also have a species that grows at very few places in a vice county or in a region. But also where a species might not be very rare or red listed, we could have something, I know it's a bad example, but we could have oxeye daisy. An oxeye daisy might be found at 200 places in the UK, but at 199 of those sites, we might only have one plant left. And on our site, we have 1,000 plants. So on sites which are host to a large proportion of the species of a given species population, then that plant's population at your site can also constitute your IEF. But as well, species recognised under local biodiversity lists, including things like your local biodiversity action plans, can also constitute that IEF. If we take this plant here, this example on the right, sea whorlgrass, really beautiful. Well, I say that, most people just think it's a bit of grass, but I think it's a really beautiful grass, Catabrosa aquatica, subspecies minor. Now, sea whorlgrass is a really special plant. It grows quite often just on the sort of sandy shores of the north west of Britain. That's pretty well where it grows and what it's specially adapted to. But it isn't only special in the habitat that it occupies, it's special because it's red listed. It's red list vulnerable. It's nationally rare. There are less than 15 places where we can see this plant, and in England, this plant pictured here from a very big population is one of 2 sites in the whole of England. So it's red listed. It's nationally rare. This plant is also recognised under a local biodiversity list, the Northwest Biodiversity Audit. I found this in Northwest England, and so that local biodiversity list is particularly relevant here and identifies this plant as an important ecological feature. So if something like sea whorlgrass was affected by a project, although it's not specially protected, although it's not a species of principal importance, a priority species, it's still an IEF, and we still need to report on it, need to assess impacts and recommend how we go about sort of avoidance, mitigation, recommendations, compensation, sorry. As well as our species of conservation importance, of course, we have invasive plant species too. And then when it comes to important species, These, in the context of plants, can also include our legally controlled species, namely our invasive non-native species of plant. One example that's sort of a lesser known invasive species is this plant. It's called Perfoliate alexanders. Better known examples can include things like Japanese knotweed and Himalayan balsam. So when we're assessing a species, it can include specially protected plants, priority plants or species of principal importance, as well as any species associated with relevant conservation designations, and invasive species. A lot of different things can constitute important ecological features, and that's just when it comes to important plant species. It's a slightly different story when it comes to our important habitats. Generally, these include habitats that are recognised in ascending order under under local biodiversity action plan sort of habitats, which could be habitats that are of local importance or above. Important habitats can include habitats of principal importance, priority habitats, including those recognised under those sort of same bits of various legislation, like Section 41 of the NERC Act for England, which can include habitats that might be, some of which might be of national importance. Where we have habitats that are recognised under Annex 1 of the Habitats Directive, however, all of these habitats are internationally important. So our important habitats can include local BAP habitats, for example, our priority habitats, habitats of principal importance, and our Annex 1 habitats, all of which are internationally important. One example I've just put on the right here, which I hope everyone can see. At the top, the top picture is a gorgeous ancient limestone grassland that also qualifies for a number of these designations. It qualifies as calcareous grassland, which is a local biodiversity action plan habitat. It also qualifies for our habitat of principal importance, a priority habitat, upland calcareous grassland. And it also qualifies for an Annex 1 habitat type, our habitat number 6210, semi-natural dry grasslands and scrubland fasces on calcareous substrates. However, unfortunately, what didn't happen at this site before a tree planting scheme was rolled out was a botanical survey. And so the people who coordinated this tree planting scheme didn't know that the grassland was an ancient limestone pasture. They didn't know that it qualified for all of these conservation designations and was indeed of international importance. And as a consequence, because no botanical survey was sort of undertaken here, a huge area of internationally important habitat is slowly but surely, now grazing's been stopped, being lost, and will eventually succumb to a very species poor secondary woodland. But as well as those relevant conservation designations, we also have irreplaceable habitats, which are essentially habitats which, once lost, are unable to be recreated elsewhere. Now, the National Planning Policy Framework for England does name a few, and I mean a few, irreplaceable habitats, including limestone pavement, blanket bog, lowland fens, sand dunes, salt marsh, as well as ancient woodlands and ancient and veteran trees. But there are a lot more, a heck of a lot more irreplaceable habitats than those named in the NPPF, National Planning Policy Framework. It can include things like our lowland raised bog. It might include ancient semi-natural grasslands. It could include incredibly old pastures that have developed over extensive periods of time and are important for certain groups of fungi, like our wax caps and earth tongues and pink gills. Irreplaceable habitats are also, they also come under that definition of an important ecological feature. Okay, so we know what our obligations as ecologists are, and we know now what comes under the definition of an IEF, important ecological features, when it comes to plants and habitats. But I hear you ask, but can't these important species and habitats just be identified during an initial appraisal, an initial walkover survey, like your preliminary ecological assessment? Well, a simple answer, no. Actually, a lot of the time, no. Identifying important habitats is not anywhere near as easy as it might sound. Quite a lot of our important habitats, especially our priority habitats and those Annex 1 habitats, may only be realistically identified through targeted botanical survey, where we get further inputs from a specialist botanist. So I've given a couple of examples here, really, or I'm about to. On the left is a picture of a scrappy bit of ash woodland. Let's pretend it's in the middle, or rather on the edge of a farmer's field. It's not identified under the relevant ancient woodland inventories that we look at. However, it is an ancient woodland and it's irreplaceable, but it also is an Annex 1 habitat, an internationally important habitat. Comes under this habitat, H9180. It's a Tilio-Assyrian forest of slopes, screes and ravines, which is an Annex 1 habitat type. So that is really, that Annex 1 category is really something we can only conclude quite often with targeted specialist botanical survey. Another example is one of the sites I had dealt with in the past. It is a beautiful bit of fixed coastal dunes with herbaceous vegetation. It's a bit of grey fixed dune. However, this picture is a picture of someone's lawn. About 100 years ago, a house was built on this site, on top of what was a dune system. The lawn is essentially still, although it's mown regularly, it's still an area of sand dune and corresponds to this Annex 1 category. Again, internationally important habitat. And so that kind of habitat that was literally someone's lawn would not have been picked up on if it weren't looked at by botanical specialists, if there wasn't that targeted specialist botanical survey. Okay. But also we've got to think about the species. During our basic habitat survey, we probably won't pick up a lot of important habitats, but also we probably won't pick up a lot of important species of plant, particularly those which are cryptic. They have features that are mean that they're hard to differentiate from one another. These are species that are difficult to identify, and many of our important species are only able to be confidently identified by a FISC level 5 botanist or above, someone with very good or excellent botanical identification skills. So plants like our sedges, a lot of our sedges are quite cryptic and hard to identify. And so on our basic habitat survey, I probably wouldn't expect a habitat surveyor to pick up that there's flat sedge on a site, which is red list vulnerable, and a species of principal importance, priority species. We've also got plants like our eyebrights, which are renowned as being cryptic, difficult to identify because we have a fair few of them. And so on my basic habitat survey, I might not, or on a basic habitat survey, you wouldn't expect a habitat surveyor to know the difference between English eyebright and other species. But it's important that we get someone in who is able to tell the difference. And it was important for this site because English eyebright is endemic, it's red list endangered in England, and it's also a species of principal importance. It's an important ecological feature. And at the extreme end of the spectrum, we also have apomictic plants like dandelions, brambles, hawkweeds, white beams. And this is a group of plants where we have a lot of endemics, a fair few red listed, species of principal importance as well. And fen dandelion, not so long ago, estimates predicted that there's no more than 500 plants of fen dandelion left in Britain. There's since been a few more records, but it is still red list vulnerable in England and an important ecological feature. And so really, the problems with basic habitat survey approaches that we commonly come across, sort of particularly for our initial appraisals of sites, basic habitat survey most of the time can't identify some really important habitats. It's not able to identify some really important species. And so that's why we need to consider further botanical survey. But as well as our species of conservation importance, we've also got a few cryptic invasive species, including our cotoneasters, many of which can only be confidently identified by a really good botanist. So we know the problems with basic habitat survey, and we know that as ecologists, it's our obligation. It's part of our obligations we need when we're involved in development projects to report on these important ecological features. So when do we recommend that further botanical survey? Well, we should really be recommending further botanical inputs and survey for every single large site that we have. As well as large sites, a lot of the people watching this might be very frequently involved in small sites with small scale developers. And so for our smaller sites, it might not always be relevant or appropriate to be recommending further botanical survey. And so what we could use to inform us whether further botanical inputs are needed is when we come across on small sites potentially important habitats, including, for example, herb-rich neutral grasslands as one example, even semi-improved ones, any semi-natural habitats, or habitats with low nutrient soils, including brownfield sites. We have magic maps, which maps under the Habitats and Species tab in areas that are covered with important plant areas. These are areas that are designated as IPAs, important plant areas, because they are areas in a national context that are important for plants. We could have old hedges, especially important hedges, which are often very good for important plant species. And so then when we're getting these old hedges on smaller sites, we might want to think about recommending further botanical survey or getting in touch with a botanical specialist to ask at least for some advice. But also sites in coastal areas, where quite often we might have properties like that example I used earlier that have been developed over a former dune system. We might have coastal specialists on our site that are important ecological features. But as well as our important species of conservation, important habitats, we've also got to think about invasive species. And so maybe if we have sites with potential issues with invasive non-native species, if we have sites that have a high diversity and abundance of non-native species, that again might be when we think about getting in touch with our botanical specialist. We can also use the presence of indicator species or axiophytes, plants that make you go ooh, as a means of sort of identifying potential importance. So if we're in a bit of woodland and we have ancient woodland indicators, but it might not be mapped as ancient woodland on a relevant ancient woodland inventory, things like wood sorrel, then that can give us some indication that we need further botanical inputs for a site. If we have a grassland with positive indicator species like devil's bit scabious, lots of common knapweed or plants like Dyer's greenweed, then that's another indication that we should really be thinking about getting further botanical inputs for a site. Just give a few examples here. So if I was to do, if someone was to do an ecological appraisal on this area of land here, we've got a very old hedgerow with some important indicator species like our navelwort, which is an axiophyte. It's a positive indicator. If we recommend further botanical surveys there, we'd find that it's host to our Jersey fern, which is a very, very rare plant indeed, confined to Jersey and Guernsey. So if we were to apply those same principles from the SIEM ECIA guidelines to this site, we could perhaps come to the conclusion that this important plant is an important ecological feature. Another example, we could be involved in a site with another old hedgerow, but it might not look too good. So we get in touch with our botanical specialist. We do our further botanical survey, and actually we find that this hedgerow is host to a huge population of this plant, Welsh groundsel, which is a Schedule 8 specially protected species. And so here, where we might have written off this hedgerow and this scrappy looking plant on the side of the hedge, getting in touch with our botanist, getting those further botanical inputs have come in extremely useful. Our developer could have committed an offence, our client could have committed an offence here and removed a specially protected species. If we're on, I don't know, one of the south coasts, we could find a peculiar white beam and some high value habitats. We could get in touch with our specialist botanist and actually find that this white beam is an incredibly important species. It's a nationally rare, super duper rare species, Sorbus richii. This is one plant species that I found on one of my sites. It's quite a large site. So I was drafted in for a habitat survey of these mostly sort of cabbage fields and agricultural land that was generally quite low value, but it was a large site. And what I did find in and amongst the cabbage fields was this plant. Purple ramping fumitory. It's a nationally scarce, endemic species that is red list vulnerable and also priority species of principal conservation importance, an IEF. So, yeah, excellent. Our botanical surveys need to, hopefully, you will have all gathered by now that it's our obligation to report on IEFs. And when it comes to plants, they can include habitats of importance. So our local BAP habitats, our priority habitats, Annex 1, our internationally important habitats, and our irreplaceable habitats. But also, our botanical survey should also include a survey and assessment of our species of importance. And these can include our specially protected plants, our priority plants, invasive species, or any species with those relevant conservation designations. Those are really the two things that we need to identify. So how do we go about doing that? Well, we now know when we should be recommending, hopefully, some further botanical inputs. But what should a botanical survey entail? Well, to identify our habitats of importance as a general rule of thumb, it could include, or rather it should include, something like a national vegetation classification survey, a detailed assessment of the communities on site. And the reason that it should include an NVC survey is because a lot of our NVC communities correspond very well with criteria set out for our Annex 1 habitats and our priority habitats. And doing an NVC survey will help identify those habitats that might not have been picked up on our initial appraisal. It might not always be appropriate to do an NVC survey, particularly for things like open mosaics on previously developed land. But as a general rule of thumb, a botanical survey should really include an NVC survey, which will help to identify those important habitats, especially Annex 1 habitats, especially priority habitats. And our NVC survey can also help with an assessment of irreplaceability, can help show whether a habitat is or is likely to be an irreplaceable habitat. But our NVC survey is just a community level assessment, a habitat, a broad brush habitat assessment. What an NVC survey doesn't do is adequately assess all of our species, all of our plant species of importance. And so that's why it's important that a botanical survey to support our project's development should include an important plant survey and assessment, which is a comprehensive walkover of a site to identify an important species, assess distribution, populations. What we should also include in our botanical survey, or rather what the botanical specialist should include in their botanical survey, is it's all well and good identifying important habitats, and it's all well and good identifying important species. But if I find something like heather, which is near threatened, but it's still relatively common and widespread throughout Britain, the importance, the relative conservation importance of heather is going to be much lower than something else. So if I was to find a plant species that's specially protected and it's only found at one place in the whole of Great Britain, well, the importance of that plant species in a geographical context is going to be much greater than our widespread heather that's just near threatened. and that might be of local importance, whereas our specially protected species, it's known from a single site, that could be of national importance or greater. And so what we should also include, or what should also be included in a botanical survey, is that geographic context for habitats and species populations. How important are these important species? How important are these important habitats? But as well as our geographic context, a botanical survey, depending on what we find and the importance of it, should also obviously include recommendations for avoidance, or less preferably, mitigation or compensation as a last resort. For those of you who don't know, or you might not be 100% sure of what the NVC is, the National Vegetation Classification, well, it is a phytosociological classification system that looks at plant communities, phytosociology, and it looks to classify and describe them. It's basically the same as a phase 1, but in a lot more detail. It splits up habitats into different community types. The sampling approach for our NVC can really vary a great deal, but generally consists of sort of targeted quadrat samples for each community. That will differ depending on the sort of experience of the botanist and the scope of our survey. And again, our NVC is there to help us identify habitats of importance. It is not an adequate means of assessing the floristic value of a site on its own, because it doesn't involve a comprehensive search for our important plant species. Our important plant survey, which should be included in tandem with our NVC survey, our community level assessment, can include a variety of survey methods to sample both terrestrial and or aquatic ecosystems. But our important plant survey, most importantly, it should allow for the best possible cover of a site. It should include a comprehensive walkover of a site. Our important plant survey might sample at different times of year, dependent upon the habitats that we have available on a given site, their respective quality, what we're likely to find, or what the botanical specialist is likely to find, and the botanical specialist's experience as well. So if we have an old woodland that's very floristically rich, we might want to time an important plant survey there between April and June, so we have a good cover of the ground flora as well as the other layers within that habitat, including our shrubs and trees and whatever else. Whereas if we have a salt marsh next to our old woodland, salt marshes are great for all kinds of specialist plants, including things like oryx and glassworts, some of which can be really important. And so for that habitat, we might want to time our important plant survey in mid to late summer to pick up those species. So yeah, with our botanical survey, our further specialist botanical survey, what we should include to pick up those important habitats, those important species, which could all constitute IEF's important ecological features. So we should be doing our MVC, or community level assessment. I keep saying we, the botanical specialist should, and the botanical specialist should also include an important plant survey in tandem with that. And doing both of those things, we can pick up all of the relevant important ecological features, at least when it comes to plants and when it comes to habitats. So just an example of where a botanical survey could come in valuable. So I've pictured an area of a site called Winmarley Moss. It's a SSI lowland raised bog. But on my botanical survey, you might have a habitat surveyor that categorises it as lowland raised bog, but that's it. If I was to come in and do my botanical survey, or NVC survey, and look at the communities here, I can identify a couple of different communities, which I've listed here. And both of these correspond to a number of different habitat conservation designations. We know that it comes under the Local Biodiversity Action Plan. We know that it's a priority habitat, and we know that it's an Annex 1, an internationally important habitat, as well as being irreplaceable. So here, our botanical survey, it's a bit of an extreme example here, SSI lowland bog, but here, hopefully you can see that our botanical survey is adding a lot more detail on top of what we have for our very basic habitat survey. And it can identify things that probably or may not be picked up by our basic level habitat survey, but also as well as our MVC survey, which can identify sort of those important habitat designations that a habitat could come under. What I've also identified on this little bit of raised bog pictured here are some important species. We've got heather, it's near threatened in England, an important species. Got common cottongrass, it's red listed too. Red list vulnerable in England, that is an important species. We've also got golden bog moss, Sphagnum pulchrum, which is nationally scarce, another important species. What we might also have is a couple of seedlings of rhododendron that weren't picked up by a basic level habitat survey, which is an invasive non-native species. Again, something that we ought to be reporting on for our ecological impact assessment or equivalent. Excellent. So hopefully you can see from this example, again, a bit of an extreme example, that our botanical survey adds a hell of a lot of value onto our ecological impact assessment and can identify an awful lot of things that a basic level habitat survey may not or would not pick up on. A geographical context, of course, it's really important to apply that geographical context to our important plants and our important habitats. And so as a botanical specialist, we should really expect them to quantify importance for us, to incorporate into our ECIA. So for habitats, we could determine the scale of importance using things like local biodiversity action plans. The British Plant Communities series by Rodwell, SSI selection criteria and other resources botanical specialists can use to ascertain importance on a geographical scale. For individual species, we can use things like distributional data. Keep saying we. Botanical specialists can use things like distributional data from BSBI maps and other resources, as well as things like species accounts and other literature to ascertain importance. Of course, there are some caveats. With important plant surveys, with our community level assessment or MVC, methods are likely to vary dependent upon the experience of the botanists themselves and the scope that they've been given. Survey scope could adapt its approach for novel habitats as well, as I said, for sites that are likely to qualify for example, open mosaics on previously developed lands, a habitat principal importance. So there are some caveats there. Brilliant. Okay. So just to summarise, the main aims of this training course were to establish when we need to identify the need for further botanical inputs or survey, but also what that botanical survey should include. So just to summarise what we've gone over today, when should we or could we recommend botanical survey or further botanical impacts? Well, for all of our large sites, we should be doing that. For our small sites, we can use the presence of potentially important habitats to indicate when we might want to consult a botanical specialist or recommend further botanical surveys. We can use the presence of positive indicator species to also help us inform decisions on whether further botanical survey is needed or not, or whether it might not be. Why do we need to consider botanical inputs beyond our basic level habitat survey, our phase 1 habitat survey? Well, there is an awful lot that is very unlikely to be picked up by someone who isn't a botanical specialist. A lot of our Annex 1 habitats, a lot of our habitats of principal importance are unlikely to be picked up on by a basic level habitat survey. And habitats of these sorts of habitats that are unlikely to be picked up by basic level habitat survey are not as rare as we might think. Annex 1 habitats I very, very regularly come across on sites, very regularly. What should a botanical survey include? Well, it should include, we know what to include in our ECIA. We need to identify habitats of importance and species of importance, and so our botanical survey should do exactly that. Identify habitats of importance, usually through our NVC survey, as well as species of importance through an important plant survey. Who would be appropriate for a botanical survey? Well, it depends on the habitats you have, but generally we'd need a very experienced botanist, ideally someone who's a FISC 5 or 6, someone with very good identification skills or excellent identification skills, who's capable of identifying those important habitats and those important species that are difficult to identify, perhaps for someone who isn't a botanical specialist. And when might be appropriate for a botanical survey? Well, the answer's not now in winter. When might be appropriate for a botanical survey depends on the habitats we have. So for our coastal salt marsh, it might be later in the late summer, later in the year, whereas for our woodlands that have a lot of species, especially ground flora, that have evolved to emerge quite early before the trees, the canopy layer develop its leaves, where we get broadleaf species. So for our woodlands, we might want to consider springtime, sort of between April and June. So when might be appropriate for a further botanical survey depends on the habitat, and it should really be our botanical specialist again that tells you when would be best for a botanical survey. Excellent. Okay, so I hope that's been very enjoyable, and I hope that people might have maybe picked up one or two things from this presentation. Now what I'd like to do is apply some of the things that I've gone over to a few examples, and please feel free, people in the live event, to contribute via the chat to these examples that I'm going to give now. Okay, so just applying some of the stuff we've gone over today. The first example is this. You, an ecologist, have become involved in a project which entails the development of nationally important infrastructure, whatever that may be, on this area of English Beach, which will need to include the removal of vegetation, of this sort of vegetation pictured here, of a 0.15 hectares of foreshore, relatively small area. The vegetation looks quite sparse, doesn't it? And the habitat itself looks to be quite species poor. So in order to ascertain the potential impacts on our important habitats, our important species, might you be inclined to either recommend a further botanical survey or get in touch with a botanist for their advice? And why? Please feel free to contribute to the chat, and I will reveal the answer momentarily. Okay. Okay, I can't see anyone typing in the chat. Oh, okay, brilliant. So Casey has said, yes, it's a coastal area. So yeah, even though it's a small site, we're in a coastal area. And therefore, potentially important habitats present. Yeah. Yes, recommend further survey because it's coastal, which might hold uncommon and protected plants and important species. Exactly right. Yeah. Matt, coastal habitat, potentially important habitats and species. Absolutely. So this particular area of beach, I've actually been involved in surveying over the past 3 years. And on this beach, there's over 150 different plant species, of which 19 qualify as important ecological features that are, if we apply that geographical context, nationally to regionally important. That's important for us to incorporate into our ECIA in this hypothetical scenario. In terms of the habitats, it qualifies for an Annex 1 habitat. So it's automatically bumped up to international importance. Also qualifies for a number, so your coastal salt marsh priority habitat, or coastal salt marsh local priority habitat. And it also falls under the definition of what an irreplaceable habitat is. It's salt marsh, essentially, at the moment. And it's an irreplaceable habitat. Okay. Second example, and please feel free to contribute. So second example, you as an ecologist are on a visit to a site to do a preliminary habitat survey, where you might be doing like a extended phase 1 or whatever, on a horse grazed pasture in the middle of an area in upland England dominated by intensively farmed fields. The site itself has a path running through it, so people use it quite a lot as well. The owner assures you that there's not much there, while the site itself is heavily grazed and it's also late in the year. Although you do notice a small sloping flushed area here on the bottom right corner. There's some devil's bit scabious, carnation sedge, both positive indicators, as well as some other positive indicators. The proposals for this site aren't to necessarily develop it, but to use it for enhancement, to fulfill the BNG, the biodiversity net gain requirements of a nearby development. In order to ascertain the potential impacts on our important ecological features, our important floristic features, Might we recommend further botanical inputs here, and why? Same question as last time. Yes, especially if it can be left ungrazed for a period of time. Yeah, I'd recommend further botanical survey due to a few indicators. Exactly. So remember, we can use indicator species to as sort of triggers for when we might get in touch with a botanical specialist and or recommend further botanical surveys. Yes, indicator species are present. Exactly right. I would survey yes. Clear potential. Exactly. So there's potentially important habitats here. We have important indicator species. Don't believe a landowner. Exactly right. I'm sure many of us who are commercial ecologists hear pretty well on a constant basis that there's no special here. Indeed, landowner would be wrong. On this site, there's more than 200 species with over 10 important plants, which are important ecological features. This sloping flushed area is also an Annex 1 habitat. It's internationally important. It could also fulfill the criteria for an irreplaceable habitat. I'm just going to rush over this third example. I know we've gone a little bit over time, sorry. But you're the lead ecologist for a new small development, new small project, which includes a small scale housing development on the coast, about 100 meters away from an SAC dune system. The proposed development will destroy a small area of introduced shrub, as well as a 20-meter stretch. Sparsely vegetated road verge looks just like this. You notice a small number of coastal specialists indicator species in the turf of this verge, including things like sand eel, screw moss, rough clover, and a reasonable diversity of other plants like lady's bedstraw. Might you recommend further botanical inputs and why? Okay. Well, I think someone's turned their microphone on. If you could make sure it's just turned off, unless you want to contribute, add something to the chat to answer this, that'd be great. I think so. Sounds like grey dune from earlier. That's exactly right. So this habitat, although it's a road verge, it's actually fixed dune grassland, and again comes under that Annex 1 conservation designation, so it's internationally important. There are large numbers of important plants here, and it could also fall under that irreplaceable habitat, the irreplaceable habitat criteria that we have. Brilliant. I'm so sorry that we've gone over time, everyone, by a little bit. If anyone would like to pause and just take a look at a few of these references that I've included, that's grand. If anyone has any questions at all, please either speak up or include them in the chat. I hope everyone has enjoyed this. I hope that everyone can take something from it. And otherwise, thank you so much, everyone, for coming along to this little online training course that I have cobbled together. Brilliant. Let's take a look at some of the questions. Josh, do you know of any one document or series which provides a list and ideally photos or floristic description of indicator species for the different important habitat types? I don't know for any one list that contains sort of a comprehensive load of indicator species, but one resource that's actually really helpful that looks at indicator species for each different habitat type is the National Plant Monitoring Scheme. I have a YouTube channel and they have really helpfully excuse me, put together YouTube videos for different habitats that look at indicator species and their identification features. So I can't think of anything off the top of my head, but the National Plant Monitoring YouTube channel is incredibly helpful and looks at indicator species. Okie dokie. Yes, as it's close to there. So let's see if we've got any more questions. I have found 160 spires of broad-leaved helleborine, which is an orchid, where our council want to tarmac for a cycle path, but I don't know how to evaluate this. I know they're not rare, but it's in abundance in an urban area. There are only 2 sites within 8 kilometres where they're recorded. They don't come up every year, so they won't necessarily be recorded. I'd suggest, Alison, that you get in touch with a botanical specialist. So pretty well all of our orchids are positive indicator species. So where we've got a lot of broadleaved helleborine or another orchid, that could indicate that the habitat itself could constitute an important ecological feature, or the habitat itself could be home to other important plants that need consideration there. Casey's just posted a link in the chat to Species Recovery Trust. Yeah, they have some great resources too. Brilliant. If anyone has any more questions that they perhaps don't want to ask in the chat, I'm just going to put this slide up here, which has my email address on it. If anyone wants to write that down and get in touch with me for any questions at all, whether it's about this course or about a site that you might have, please feel free to drop me an email. Otherwise, I hope this has been an enjoyable course for you on a Saturday morning. And yeah, I look forward to hearing from some of you soon. Brilliant. I'm going to stop recording now.